Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. Apalachicola River in southwest Georgia, November 30th, 1817. A U.S. Army boat transporting supplies, along with 26 soldiers, 7 soldiers' wives, and their children, chart a path across the stream in modern-day Decatur County, Georgia, under the command of Lieutenant Scott. The air is brisk, but as the party approaches the confluence of the Apalachicola and Flint rivers, an eerie and unsettling sight befalls their eyes. Dozens of native warriors begin to appear standing and glaring upon them from the riverbanks. Yet most of the passengers upon this U.S. Army vessel can scarcely imagine the unmitigated horror that will soon be unleashed upon them, the massacre that will follow, and the haunting recollections of it that will unnerve the American population and set forth events that will reshape the geopolitical landscape of the American South for centuries to come. Tensions between the native populations of the South and the empires who laid claim upon their territories, be it France, Spain, Britain, or the newly birthed United States, had been in an ongoing struggle for many years, with various alliances with and against one another. From the recent Patriot War of East Florida that saw President Madison's desire to expand American territorial holdings in Florida from Spain, to the Creek War that saw soon-to-be President Andrew Jackson engaged in fierce combat with the Red Stick people over territories in the Deep South, to involvement by natives in the War of 1812 between the United States and Britain. A bloody tapestry was weaved through the recent history of the land. As periods of factional peace bled into smaller and larger conflicts, it seemed as though the fighting would never cease. The Scott Massacre marked a significant elevation in the hostilities that had been going on between the United States and the Lower Creek peoples, as well as the Creek's offshoot, the Seminole Nation. U.S. forces had sought the arrest of Seminole leader Neamathla, and, after repeated attempts in getting him to present himself were denied, an American expedition to his village of Foultown was led by Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Arbuckle of the 7th U.S. Infantry Regiment. Neamathla is a name of Creek origin, meaning fat warrior, though the title also meant large and exceedingly brave. And the Creek leader would demonstrate the accuracy of this description throughout the rest of his life. The incursion into Foultown had taken part in 2 exchanges. First, in a brief firefight that had resulted in a few casualties for the natives, including a woman, after which Neamathla retreated his people to the confines of a swamp, a tactic that would be used repeatedly by the natives throughout the entirety of the Seminole Wars. While the skirmish had certainly elevated tensions between the two parties, the return of American forces on the 23rd of November would turn the dispute into a bitter conflict of survival for Neamathla and his people. As the Americans returned to Foultown to find it abandoned, they discovered the natives' stockpile of corn and began to load it out in wagons. The corn reserves were absolutely critical to their survival of the upcoming winter, and upon learning of this action, Neamathla launched an assault on the Americans that resulted in several of the native warriors being shot down. They felt even though the odds of success in battle were grave, they would be condemned to a bleak and starved existence in the coming months if they did not take swift and decisive action. Whatever hopes there had been for peace between the Americans and the Creek and Red Stick peoples were now dashed. The incidents at Foultown had enraged thousands of southern natives. Large parties of warriors began moving to reinforce Neamathla and to block off the Apalachicola River to prevent the movement of supplies to Fort Scott. Revenge weighed heavily on their minds, and it would soon manifest itself in an abhorrent and grisly form. Major Peter Muhlenberg held command over supply ships making their way upriver on the Apalachicola. The major was unsettled that General Gaines had failed to deliver him significant help in his endeavor. When Lieutenant Scott reached his flotilla, he had but his single vessel, and only 40 men under his command upon it. Muhlenberg was unaware of the events of Foultown. He would replace half of Lieutenant Scott's able-bodied men with sick, unarmed soldiers, 7 soldiers' wives, and 4 children. Then load the vessel with as much regimental clothing as he could, and send them on towards Fort Scott. Lieutenant Scott carried with him a message to be delivered upon his arrival to the fort requesting additional support be sent down to Muhlenberg, but it was a message that Scott would never be able to convey. The lieutenant did not encounter any difficulties upon the first leg of his journey. However, Scott was unnerved by the increased presence of warriors along the riverside. They were still unaware of the events of Foultown, but would soon learn of it upon their arrival to the Spanish Bluff, where a couple of traders had built their homes. The men had lived among the natives for years, dating back long before the War of 1812. Scott was shocked to hear of the hostilities at Foultown, and the traders gave him a dire warning that hundreds of Seminole, Maroon, and Red Stick warriors were now descending upon the Apalachicola in support of Neamathla. The traders implored Lieutenant Scott to hold off on the remainder of his mission until reinforcements could be sent from the fort to protect them. Attacks upon boats on the river by the Seminole and Red Sticks were inevitable. Scott wrote to General Gaines and informed him of the gentleman's advisement by name. Quote, "Mr. Hamley informs me that the Indians are assembling at the junction of the rivers, where they intend to make a stand against those vessels coming up the river. Should this be the case, I am not able to make a stand against them. My command does not exceed 40 men, one half of which is sick and without arms. I leave this immediately." There can be no doubt, after reading that letter, that Lieutenant Scott was fully aware of the dire circumstances he now found himself within. Yet, he was unwilling to delay his voyage another moment in spite of these startling revelations. It would take the courier 2 full days to deliver the message to General Gaines. Perhaps Scott had expected the correspondence to arrive much sooner, and for relief to arrive before he reached the dangerous confluence of rivers where an attack was most likely to take place. But whatever the reasoning, Scott had just made a confounding miscalculation that would bear from it dreadful consequences. Lieutenant Scott continued up the Apalachicola River from Spanish Bluff, fully aware of the threats he faced. General Gaines would question the move by Scott in the aftermath of what was soon to follow. Quote, "It appears, however, by a letter from Lieutenant Scott, received about the hour in which he was attacked, that he had been warned of the danger which awaited him. I must therefore conclude that he felt it his duty to proceed. Whether he had received from Major Muhlenberg a positive order to this effect, I have not learned." After leaving the home of the traders upon Spanish Bluff, the depleted men of Scott's vessel rowed hard against the high waters of the river. While very little is known of the construction of the ship, aside from its long oars, its size enough to hold 50 individuals, along with a decent supply of cargo, and that it was uncovered. The primary defenses of the boat, and the only ones of consequence, were the 20 muskets carried by the able-bodied soldiers aboard. Tensions rose within the watercraft as the boat made its slow and perilous journey. Survivors of the attack would recount to General Gaines that they had seen hundreds of warriors along the banks of the river after their departure from Spanish Bluff. Estimates ranged north of 500 native warriors having been spotted. On the morning of November 30th, 1817, the vessel approached the confluence of the Flint and Chattahoochee River, and the bloodiest day of the First Seminole War had now commenced. Only a handful of survivors would live to recount the gruesome events to follow. The chilly late November air caused a shiver amongst many aboard Lieutenant Scott's vessel, nearly half of which struggled with fits of brutal fever that had gripped several of the soldiers. While they suffered physically, the pressing concern was the appearance of the dozens of Creek, Seminole, Yuchi, and African Maroon warriors. Scott's boat came around a bend in the river, revealing they were just 2 miles ahead of the confluence of the rivers. The river was in the early stages of its winter rise, making the current even stronger. As they neared the widest part of the bend, the fast-moving waters pushed the boat from the center of the river near the east bank. The men aboard rowed fiercely against it, but the current ran hard into the side of the boat, pushing it even closer to the perimeter. Hundreds of warriors waited in the thick of the bushes and trees just beyond the riverbank, their faces streaked with war paint, rifles at the ready. They came from all over, and some were even residents of Foultown. Some spoke English, Spanish, French, or Muskogee. The high command of this broad contingent was Homathlamiko, a Red Stick chief from Alabama. Though he is recognized as the commander, the men would function as uniquely assembled war parties, all acting independently of one another, but to the end cause of the same vicious outcome. They combined to outnumber the men of Scott's craft more than 25-1. Scott and his men were preoccupied with getting their boat through the bend and back into the strait of the river when the first shots were fired upon them. Recalled by one of the survivors, quote, "The Indians had formed along the riverbank and were not discovered until the fire commenced, in the first volley of which Lieutenant Scott and his most valuable men fell." The opening volley had managed to cut down Scott and the majority of his men who could mount any significant defense of the vessel. They fell before even so much as firing a single shot that day. The confederation of warriors that lined the east bank gave out an eclectic mash of spirited cries. Their sounds of gunfire and hollering drowned out the fearful bellows of the women and children, and the agonizing groans of the American wounded on board their doomed mission. A soldier known only by his last name, Gray, had been badly wounded in the opening salvo of the native coalition. He would be one of the few survivors, and recount that fateful morning around a campfire at Fort Scott. The account was recorded and told to Major Thomas Woodward. Quote, "As those on board were hooking and jamming near the bank and opposite a thick canebrake, the Indians fired upon them, killing and wounding most of those on board at the first fire. Those not disabled from the first fire of the Indians made the best fight they could, but all on board were killed except Mrs. Stewart and 2 soldiers, myself and another man whose name I have forgotten, if I ever knew it. They were both shot, but made their escape by swimming to the opposite shore. 6 or 7 soldiers had actually survived the attack. The Mrs. Stewart referred to in Gray's account was Elizabeth Stewart, the wife of a 1st Brigade soldier. Her husband was not on board. Of the 11 civilians present, only Elizabeth would survive, with 1 being abducted." Gray recounted that after the first volley, the boat ran aground in the shallows of the east side of the river, and that many warriors converged upon the vessel. The only significant resistance in the entire disastrous event by the Americans came from Sergeant Frederick McIntosh of the 7th Infantry, who made a valiant last stand. Quote, "When he found all on the boat were lost, and nothing more could be done, he went into a little kind of cabin that the lieutenant had occupied as his quarters, in which was a swivel or small cannon. He loaded it, took it on the deck, and resting the swivel on one arm ranged it as well as he could, and with a firebrand he set off the swivel, which cleared the boat for a few minutes of Indians. At the firing of the swivel, he was thrown overboard and drowned." This defiant last act in the face of assured defeat allowed badly wounded Gray the opportunity to swim to the west shore of the river and escape the massacre. Scott was found still alive but wounded by the natives. He was killed by having hunks of fatwood hammered into his body and then set afire. It was, quote, "an excruciating form of execution that had its roots deep in the ancient traditions of the Creek Indians." The shocking events of the Scott Massacre had stoked the fire of the Americans even higher than their contemporaries after the incursion at Foultown. And now, with both sides inflamed and at one another's throats, the stage would be set for a dramatic conclusion to the First Seminole War. Gray would recuperate from his injuries at Fort Scott through the winter, and he was still taking his quarters there when the man who would bring this conflict to a violent conclusion arrived in March of 1818, Major General Andrew Jackson. But the end to this abrupt and brutal saga is, for tonight, another story for another time. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click subscribe, hit the like button, and share this episode with a friend. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button below, or click the link in the description to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.